Tragedy at the Tea Shop, narrated by Connor from Velvet Clues. Welcome, dear listeners, and thank you for joining us this evening on Velvet Clues. Before we begin this intriguing tale, I'd like to pose a question to you. Have you ever experienced a moment when something perfectly ordinary suddenly transformed into something sinister? When a simple afternoon tea became the stage for an unexpected tragedy? Do share your thoughts in the comments below, as I always find your perspectives fascinating. Now, settle in with your beverage of choice and let us explore the mysterious circumstances surrounding the death of one man in a quiet village tea shop. Chapter 1. The Whistle of the Kettle and an Unexpected Guest. The autumn afternoon had painted St. Clement's village in shades of amber and crimson, with leaves drifting lazily past the shop windows of the high street. Miss Jane Marple, having just completed her weekly visit to the greengrocer's, found herself drawn toward the Blue Teapot, that most reliable of village establishments where tea was served at precisely the right temperature and scones arrived warm from the oven. The shop bell chimed its familiar greeting as she pushed open the heavy wooden door, and she was immediately enveloped in the comforting aroma of Earl Grey and freshly baked pastries. The interior of the Blue Teapot had remained virtually unchanged for the past 20 years, with its blue and white gingham curtains, small round tables topped with embroidered cloths, and the perpetual gleam of polished silver. Miss Marple had observed this place so often that she could recite the precise arrangement of flowers in the central arrangement, or note when a single teacup had been replaced. It was this intimate familiarity that made her subsequent observations all the more significant. She selected her customary table near the window and settled herself with the quiet authority of a woman who had occupied the same chair for several years. It was just past 3 o'clock when a stranger entered the tea shop, and Miss Marple's keen eyes immediately registered this deviation from the ordinary pattern of village life. He was a man of perhaps 45 years, with the brisk movements and sharp features one associated with those whose professions required constant vigilance and acute observation. The gentleman ordered a pot of tea and a buttered scone, settling himself at a table directly across from Miss Marple with the careful deliberation of someone accustomed to positioning himself strategically. She noted his quick survey of the room, the way his eyes catalogued each occupant, the way his fingers drummed briefly on the table, in what appeared to be nervous anticipation. Here, she reflected, was a man burdened with purpose. Before Miss Marple could determine precisely what it was about this stranger that commanded her attention, the waitress appeared with his refreshments. This was curious in itself, for Miss Marple had observed that Rosemary Tucker, the usual waitress, was ordinarily prone to a particular awkwardness in her movements. The girl had worked at the Blue Teapot for scarcely 2 years, and though she was dependable, she possessed an unfortunate tendency to stumble over chair legs or arrive at tables with one hand aloft and the other trailing dangerously behind. Yet this afternoon, Rosemary's movements were remarkably fluid and precise. The teapot was placed with deliberate care, the scone arranged on its plate with the coordination of someone who had rehearsed the action multiple times. Miss Marple found herself filing away this observation alongside several others that constituted an interesting pattern of deviations from the expected. The stranger lifted the teacup to his lips and took a measured sip, then turned his attention to the scone. He had consumed perhaps half of it when Miss Marple observed the first signs of distress. His hand trembled slightly as he lowered the plate, and a distinct pallor seemed to overtake his previously unanimated complexion. He gripped the edge of the table with obvious effort, his breathing becoming laboured. Miss Marple rose from her chair with the measured deliberation that characterised all her movements, though her pulse quickened noticeably. She was reaching his table just as the stranger attempted to stand, his movements now distinctly uncoordinated. He uttered a single hoarse cry that drew the immediate attention of everyone present in the shop. Within moments he collapsed backward, his body convulsing with obvious distress. Rosemary appeared at once, and this was the second remarkable observation that Miss Marple made that afternoon. The waitress, ordinarily prone to panic at the slightest irregularity, remained absolutely composed. Her movements were efficient and measured as she moved toward the fallen man. She did not scream or call for assistance in that scattered manner typical of someone overcome by surprise. Instead, she turned to the proprietress and spoke with a calmness that seemed entirely inconsistent with the gravity of the situation. "Mrs. Felicity," she said quietly to the elderly proprietress, "we should telephone for Dr. Haddock at once, but do so from the back room, if you please." The crisis resolved itself with surprising speed. Dr. Haddock arrived within 10 minutes, though his examination lasted scarcely 3 before he rose from the stranger's side with an expression of profound resignation. "I'm afraid the gentleman has passed away," he announced to the assembled company. "The cause appears to be some form of sudden medical crisis, though I cannot determine precisely what without a proper examination. Nothing could be done for him, I'm sorry to say. The constable was summoned, and the afternoon's pleasant routines dissolved into the machinery of official procedure. Yet Miss Marple remained conspicuously calm, occupied her seat, and observed with meticulous attention the reactions of those around her. She noted how Rosemary Tucker's hands, despite the young woman's carefully maintained composure, trembled ever so slightly as she began to clear the tables nearby. She noticed the glance that passed between Rosemary and Mrs. Felicity, a glance that conveyed considerably more than mere concern for a deceased patron. It was only after the body had been removed and the initial confusion had subsided that Inspector Slack arrived to begin his preliminary inquiries. Miss Marple offered her assistance naturally, and through her gentle questioning learned that the deceased was one Thomas Whitmore, a private investigator from London who had made an appointment to meet with Miss Marple that very afternoon. The implications of this information settled upon her like a sudden chill, for she had been expecting no such visitor, and the man's presence in the village suggested circumstances considerably more complicated than a simple medical emergency. Chapter 2. Spoons beneath the soil and secrets in the ground. The discovery that the deceased had been a private investigator transformed the tone of Inspector Slack's investigation from routine procedure to something considerably more purposeful. Over tea at Miss Marple's cottage that evening, the inspector shared certain details that clarified the situation's more troubling aspects. Whitmore had been engaged by parties unknown to investigate matters pertaining to the village, the inspector explained, consulting his notebook. His investigation apparently concerned an individual or individuals of considerable standing in the community. The inspector seemed reluctant to elaborate further, but Miss Marple's keen questions eventually drew forth the information that Whitmore had specifically requested to meet with her, suggesting that he believed her observations might prove pertinent to his inquiries. The next morning brought further complications in the form of a discovery made by young William Torrance, who served as gardener for several of the village's more prominent residents. William had been engaged in clearing the woodland path that led through the copse behind the rectory when his spade struck something metallic buried several inches beneath the soil. His excavations revealed a small canvas bag containing a dozen silver spoons, each bearing the distinctive hallmark of the Blue Teapot, along with what appeared to be a handkerchief stained with what William was fairly certain was blood. The discovery created considerable sensation in the village, and by midday the police had secured the area and begun their systematic investigations. Miss Marple, having learned of these developments through the efficient communication network that served all English villages, made her way to the scene with her walking stick and an expression of mild concern that successfully disguised her intense intellectual engagement with the puzzle. Inspector Slack greeted her with visible relief, for he had learned through experience that Miss Marple's observations often proved more valuable than weeks of conventional investigation. "The spoons are certainly from the Blue Teapot," he confirmed, running his finger along one of the tarnished vessels. "Mrs. Felicity has identified them as part of her original service, purchased nearly 15 years ago. The question is, why were they buried here, and whose blood is on this handkerchief?" Miss Marple examined the handkerchief with careful attention to the monogram visible despite the staining. The initials were RT, which corresponded to those of Rosemary Tucker, Numgor, the waitress at the Blue Teapot. Yet Miss Marple's examination revealed something that seemed to escape the inspector's attention. She observed that the staining appeared remarkably fresh, certainly not the result of the same incident that prompted the burial of the spoons, which by their oxidized condition must have lain in the soil for several months. Moreover, she noted that the blood staining was concentrated in the pattern one would expect if a hand had pressed the fabric against a fresh wound, a wound incurred sometime in recent days rather than distant months. Here, then, was evidence of considerable complexity, suggesting not one incident but several, separated by time and possibly by motive. Inspector Slack seemed puzzled by these observations, but Miss Marple, now thoroughly engaged with the puzzle, turned her attention to the matter of why the spoons had been buried in the first place. A theft, perhaps, she suggested gently to the inspector. Yet Mrs. Felicity informed you that the spoons were never reported as missing, did she not? The inspector confirmed this with evident frustration. Precisely my confusion, Miss Marple. If they had been stolen and subsequently recovered, one would expect some accounting of their absence. Yet the proprietress claims that the spoons have been present in the shop throughout the entire period in which they were supposedly buried beneath this woodland soil. Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles and allowed herself a slight smile. I suspect, Inspector, that what you have discovered here is not evidence of theft, but rather evidence of a hiding place. Yeah, perhaps used by someone to conceal or protect objects that they intended to retrieve at a later time. The spoons may have been chosen simply because they provided weight and bulk sufficient to anchor the canvas bag against the disturbances of small woodland creatures. This interpretation led the investigators to turn their attention more closely to Rosemary Tucker, and Miss Marple, through her methodical questioning of various villagers, began to construct a picture of a young woman whose circumstances were considerably more complicated than her employment as a waitress might suggest. Chapter 3. Whispers in the Rectory and the Vicar's Troubled Son. Miss Marple had long since learned that gossip, when carefully analysed, often conveyed essential truths disguised beneath layers of speculation and social convention. Accordingly, she made her way to visit Mrs. Cleary, the wife of the village's retired schoolmaster, whose attention to the details of village life was matched only by her discretion in discussing them. Over tea in Mrs. Cleary's pleasant sitting room, Miss Marple posed careful questions that seemed to concern the general state of village news, but were in fact precisely targeted toward particular individuals. It was through this method that she learned that Rosemary Tucker had once been engaged to a man named William Ashford, the vicar's son, but that the engagement had been mysteriously broken off approximately 6 months prior. Furthermore, William Ashford had recently returned to the village after a prolonged absence, supposedly having concluded certain business matters in London. Yet Miss Marple's gentle inquiries revealed that his movements during his time away had been remarkably consistent with someone engaged in seeking legal advice regarding matrimonial complications. This intelligence proved most intriguing, for it suggested a potential entanglement considerably more significant than a simple romantic disagreement. Miss Marple's mind, conditioned by decades of observing village life and the patterns of human behaviour, began to construct a narrative that connected the presence of Thomas Whitmore, the death at the Blue Teapot, and the mysterious burial of the spoons into a coherent whole. She requested an audience with the vicar, an elderly gentleman named Reverend Ashford, under the pretext of discussing the upcoming Christmas charity drive. The Reverend received her in his study with the warmth appropriate to an established parishioner, and Miss Marple was able to observe considerable anxiety in his manner, a tension that seemed entirely inconsistent with the pleasant topic of charitable donations. "Vicar," she said gently, after the preliminary courtesies had been observed, "I find myself troubled by certain matters that have come to my attention. I wonder whether you might assist me in understanding them." The vicar's face paled slightly at this inquiry, and Miss Marple observed the trembling of his hands as he poured her tea with evident difficulty. "I'm not entirely certain what you mean, Miss Marple," he replied carefully. "The village has experienced unfortunate events this week, certainly, but I cannot imagine how such matters would concern the charity committee." Miss Marple set down her cup with deliberate care. "The matter concerns your son, William, and a young woman named Beatrice Hartley, who, unless I am very much mistaken, is currently William's wife in London, even as he maintains another residence and family arrangement here in the village." The vicar's distress became immediately apparent, and Miss Marple found herself extending sympathy to a man caught in the uncomfortable position of being confronted with sins that involved his own blood relations. "William made a dreadful mistake years ago," the vicar admitted, after a prolonged silence. "He had married Beatrice in London under circumstances we will not discuss, and the marriage was supposedly annulled. But when he returned to take a position in the parish and became engaged to Rosemary Tucker, it transpired that the annulment had never been properly concluded. His marriage to Beatrice remained valid in the eyes of the law." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, and Thomas Whitmore, the private investigator who died in the Blue Teapot, was engaged by someone to uncover this deception. The vicar's silence confirmed her deduction, and Miss Marple found herself possessed of several crucial pieces of the puzzle that had seemed so confused merely hours before. Chapter 4. A waitress's steady hand and steadier nerve. With the knowledge of William Ashford's bigamy now established as the central element of the mystery, Miss Marple's attention returned to the curious composure displayed by Rosemary Tucker during the crisis in the Blue Teapot. She requested a private conversation with the young woman at the tea shop, and Rosemary, while clearly anxious about this interview, agreed to speak with her during the establishment's quiet hour just before closing. "I have observed," Miss Marple began gently, "that during the crisis when the gentleman collapsed you remained remarkably composed. Yet in my experience of young women your age, such composure is generally reserved for those who have experienced considerable distress, or who possess knowledge that others do not." Rosemary's face flushed deeply, and she gripped her apron with trembling fingers. I'm not certain I understand what you're suggesting, Miss Marple." Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles and fixed the young woman with a kind but penetrating gaze. "I'm suggesting that you anticipated the gentleman's collapse. Perhaps you even knew his identity before he entered the Blue Teapot." The young waitress seemed to struggle with conflicting impulses before finally collapsing into a chair with evident emotional exhaustion. "Yes," she whispered, "I knew who he was. William came to me and explained that a private investigator had been engaged to uncover his situation with Beatrice. He said if Mr. Whitmore left the village alive, everything would be ruined, not just for him, but for his father and for me. He would remain trapped in a marriage that was never truly valid, and I would be left in limbo, unable to marry, unable to build a life with anyone. And so," Miss Marple ventured carefully, "you assisted William in arranging for Mr. Whitmore to meet an unfortunate end at the Blue Teapot." Rosemary shook her head vigorously. "I didn't give him poison, if that's what you're suggesting. I don't even know what poison looks like. But William gave me a small vial and told me to add it to the scone just before serving it. He said it would look like a natural death, that no one would suspect anything. I thought he was wrong, but I did it anyway because I loved him." The waitress's anguish was evident, and Miss Marple felt the familiar sorrow that accompanied discoveries of human weakness and desperation. "You have made a grave error, my dear," she said softly. "One that will require confession to the authorities if we are to prevent further tragedy." Chapter 5. Bloodstains and Betrayal. Inspector Slack received Miss Marple's revelation with the grim acknowledgement of a man who had anticipated such complications. He arranged for Rosemary's formal interview at the police station, and during the course of this conversation, further details emerged that clarified the matter of the blood-stained handkerchief and the buried spoons. Rosemary revealed that William Ashford had enlisted her assistance in concealing evidence of his crime. The buried spoons had been part of an elaborate cover story designed to suggest that Rosemary had been involved in theft from the Blue Teapot, thereby providing alternative explanations for her apparent knowledge of Whitmore's death. Additionally, William had taken Rosemary's handkerchief and deliberately wounded himself, staining the fabric with his own blood, in order to create evidence that might further implicate her if the authorities began to suspect her involvement. The deliberate framing of the young woman spoke to a callousness in William's character that seemed almost incomprehensible to those who had known him as the vicar's son. Yet Miss Marple, whose long observation of village life had taught her that respectability and moral uprightness were not always correlative, found herself unsurprised by these revelations. Inspector Slack apprehended William Ashford at the vicarage, where the young man was found in his room preparing to flee to London to rejoin his wife Beatrice. A more thorough investigation revealed that William had indeed obtained the poison used in Whitmore's death through a contact in London, someone who had provided the substance under the impression that it was intended for laboratory purposes rather than homicidal ones. The complexity of the conspiracy, involving William's wife Beatrice in London, Rosemary's emotional vulnerability, and Thomas Whitmore's professional investigation, created a web of motivations and circumstances that took considerable time to fully unravel. Yet the fundamental truth remained immutable. William Ashford had committed murder to conceal his bigamy, had exploited Rosemary's affections to secure her complicity, and had attempted to transfer blame for his crime onto an innocent young woman. Chapter 6. The Vicar's Confession and the Weight of Silence. In the days following William's arrest, the village of St. Clement's found itself engulfed in scandal of unprecedented proportions. The news spread with the inexorable momentum of village gossip, transmitted through the careful channels of conversation at church, over garden fences, and through the hushed discussions that occurred in the various sitting rooms where ladies gathered for tea. The fact that the vicar's own son had committed murder in broad daylight, and had deliberately poisoned an innocent visitor to the parish, seemed almost too extraordinary to be believed by those who had known William since his childhood. Reverend Ashford, devastated by his son's actions, made a personal visit to Miss Marple's cottage to discuss the unhappy circumstances that had led to such tragedy. He arrived on an afternoon when the autumn rain was falling, with particular persistence, and he appeared at her door without the customary social pleasantries, his face bearing the expression of a man whose entire understanding of the world had been fundamentally disrupted. The vicar appeared to have aged considerably in merely days. His shoulders bent beneath the weight of shame and sorrow that seemed almost palpable in its intensity. Miss Marple received him with characteristic compassion, though her mind remained engaged with the patterns of motivation and circumstance that had produced such devastating consequences. She settled him in her sitting room, provided him with tea that he scarcely touched, and waited with patient silence for him to articulate the purpose of his visit. "I have failed as a father," the vicar said without preamble, his voice hollow with despair. William was always a brilliant child, charming and persuasive in ways that marked him as different from his siblings even from his earliest years. But somewhere along his path, he learned to transform these gifts into instruments of deception and self-advancement. I should have perceived the danger earlier, should have applied firmer guidance when his character first began to demonstrate these troubling tendencies. The vicar rose from his chair and moved to the window, gazing out at the rain-soaked garden with the absorbed attention of someone seeking answers in the landscape itself. He was always so accomplished at concealment, he continued, his voice barely audible above the sound of the rain. I recall now moments when I suspected he was not entirely truthful with me, yet I chose to accept his explanations rather than probe more deeply. A parent's blindness, perhaps, or a cowardice disguised as trust. Either way, my failure has resulted in the death of an innocent man and the destruction of 3 lives beyond his own. Miss Marple, despite her usual reserve, found herself extending a degree of comfort to a man she'd known for 40 years. "We often misjudge the interior landscape of even those closest to us, Vicar," she said gently. "Our children, despite knowing them from their first breath, retain mysteries that we never fully penetrate. William's choices are his own responsibility, though I do not doubt that your grief is profound. Moreover, I would suggest that William possessed capabilities for deception that would have deceived anyone, not merely his parents. He had cultivated a persona so carefully constructed that it required the intervention of a professional investigator to penetrate it. The vicar seemed somewhat comforted by this interpretation, though Miss Marple observed that no words could truly ease the burden he carried. He returned to his seat and spoke for nearly an hour about William's childhood, his academic achievements, his apparent virtue and devotion to family. Yet as the vicar spoke, certain patterns emerged that Miss Marple noted with her usual attention to behavioural inconsistencies. William had regularly employed flattery and manipulation to achieve his desired outcomes. He had demonstrated a capacity for brilliant performance in public settings while maintaining an entirely different demeanour in private. He had possessed an absolute conviction in his own superiority that manifested itself in his willingness to circumvent rules and moral constraints that he considered beneath his consideration. The conversation gradually turned to practical matters, and the vicar revealed that he intended to retire from his position immediately. He could not continue to serve as a moral authority in the parish given the moral failure evident in his own household. Moreover, he felt that his continued presence would only serve to reinforce the scandal for his parishioners and would undermine his capacity to provide effective spiritual guidance to those who had lost faith in both him and the institution he represented. Miss Marple did not attempt to dissuade him from this course, recognizing that such decisions, once crystallized in the mind of a person of conscience, resist external persuasion. She understood that the vicar's retirement was not merely a practical response to scandal, but rather an expression of his belief that he bore some portion of responsibility for the moral corruption that had manifested itself in his son's actions. She merely offered what support she could through her words and through her presence as a representative of the village that had known him for so many years. Before he departed, the vicar pressed into her hands a small package containing William's childhood journals, asking that she read them and perhaps offer some insight into the development of his son's character. Miss Marple accepted this responsibility with full understanding of its significance and promised to examine the documents carefully. That evening, as darkness fell and the autumn rain continued its assault upon the cottage, Miss Marple opened William's journals and began to read. What she discovered in those pages was a gradual progression from youthful egocentrism to something considerably darker and more calculated. The early entries revealed a child of exceptional intelligence who experienced genuine emotional connections with those around him. Yet by adolescence, the journal entries began to demonstrate a troubling evolution. William wrote of relationships as tools to be manipulated, of moral principles as obstacles to overcome, of other people primarily as instruments for the achievement of his own ambitions. By the time William reached his late teens, the journals revealed a person who had achieved complete dissociation between his public persona and his private reality. He could describe manipulating his parents with cool detachment, playing upon their expectations and affections to extract what he desired. He wrote of his engagement to Rosemary with clinical precision. Green, noting that her emotional devotion would prove useful in controlling her behaviour should he ever require her cooperation in matters beyond her comprehension. Yet, most disturbing of all was an entry dated approximately 18 months prior to his crime, in which William had written about his discovery of Beatrice's existence and his realization that his London marriage had never been properly dissolved. His response to this discovery was not panic or concern, but rather a calculating assessment of his options. He had outlined in careful detail various methods of resolving the complication that Beatrice represented, including marriage dissolution, but also including more permanent solutions. The existence of this journal entry provided chilling evidence that William's decision to commit murder had been deliberated far in advance. Carefully considered and consciously chosen as the most efficacious solution to his circumstances. Chapter 7. The question of Beatrice Ashford. While William's guilt in Whitmore's death was established beyond reasonable doubt, Inspector Slack found himself troubled by the matter of his wife Beatrice in London. Had she known of his intention to commit murder? Had she encouraged him in his crime? Or was she herself a victim of William's manipulation, much as Rosemary had been? These questions occupied the inspector's mind with increasing intensity as the days following William's arrest passed into a week, and then into 2 weeks of preliminary examination and investigation. Miss Marple, recognising the inspector's uncertainty and understanding that this uncertainty clouded his ability to perceive the full scope of the crime, offered to assist in clarifying this matter through correspondence. She composed a carefully worded letter to Beatrice Ashford, presenting herself as a sympathetic observer concerned with understanding the fuller circumstances of the tragedy. The letter was crafted with all of Miss Marple's considerable skill in human persuasion, appealing to Beatrice's sense of justice and her desire to ensure that the truth regarding her husband's actions be fully understood. The response, when it arrived 2 weeks later, proved illuminating in ways that neither Miss Marple nor Inspector Slack had entirely anticipated. Beatrice was herself a woman of approximately 30 years, trapped in a marriage that had been conducted entirely on the basis of deception and false representations. She had married William 7 years prior, believing him to be a respectable young man of good family whose career prospects were promising and whose character was beyond reproach. Only gradually had she come to suspect that his affections were divided, that he maintained contact with another woman in his village of origin, and that he deliberately constructed his life in London with the primary purpose of evading the complications created by his earlier entanglement. Moreover, Beatrice revealed that William had explicitly informed her of his intention to solve his matrimonial problem through Whitmore's death. This revelation came to her in the form of a letter that she'd preserved in its entirety and was now willing to surrender to the authorities. The letter was written in William's characteristically precise hand and detailed his frustration with the investigator's presence in the village, his conviction that Whitmore's existence posed an insuperable obstacle to his continued arrangement with Rosemary, and his determination that the investigator should be removed as an obstacle to his plans. She had been horrified by this communication and had immediately attempted to dissuade him through several urgent letters, employing every argument she could construct to convince him that murder was an act of desperation that would inevitably result in his discovery and imprisonment. However, recognizing that he would likely proceed regardless of her objections, she'd taken the precaution of documenting their correspondence in the event that her testimony might someday be required to establish the truth of the matter. She had copied William's letter in her own hand, creating a duplicate that she stored in a secure location known only to her solicitor. This revelation transformed Beatrice from a potential co-conspirator into a witness of considerable importance, and her detailed account of William's state of mind and his explicit statements regarding his murderous intention provided the prosecution with evidence of undeniable weight. When she was called to testify at William's trial, her testimony proved devastating to any remaining possibility that he might claim the murder was a spontaneous act, a moment of temporary insanity, or any of the other diminishing circumstances that sometimes sway juries toward clemency. Inspector Slack, meeting with Miss Marple after receiving Beatrice's correspondence, expressed his gratitude for her insight in pursuing this particular line of inquiry. I'd begun to suspect that Beatrice possessed greater knowledge of William's intentions than she had initially revealed, he said, consulting the letter with evident satisfaction. Yet without your intervention, I might never have persuaded her to provide this documentation. Her testimony transforms this matter from a case requiring circumstantial proof into one possessing direct evidence of premeditation. Miss Marple, however, found herself troubled by Beatrice's circumstances in ways that transcended the practical necessity of securing a conviction against William. She reflected that Beatrice had been victimized not merely by her husband's bigamy and his murderous intentions, but also by the moral burden imposed upon her by the possession of knowledge that made her responsible for ensuring that his crime did not go unpunished. She had been forced to choose between loyalty to her husband and loyalty to justice, between the natural instinct to protect a spouse and the moral imperative to prevent an innocent man's death. Accordingly, Miss Marple took the liberty of visiting Beatrice in London, a journey that she undertook with some reluctance but with full recognition of its necessity. She found Beatrice to be a woman of considerable strength and dignity, someone who had endured her husband's deception with a stoicism that suggested deep reserves of inner strength. Over tea in Beatrice's modest flat, Miss Marple found herself engaged in a conversation that ranged far beyond the immediate circumstances of William's crime into the broader question of how women must navigate the complications of matrimonial disappointment and betrayal. Beatrice expressed gratitude for Miss Marple's visit and her attention to the circumstances surrounding the tragedy. She spoke of her intention to pursue a divorce action as soon as the legal proceedings against William were concluded, and she indicated that she intended to rebuild her life independent of any matrimonial arrangement. Moreover, she revealed that she had been offered a position as a secretary to a woman author of some renown, a position that would afford her both financial independence and intellectual engagement with creative endeavours. Miss Marple, departing from her usual reserve, extended to Beatrice both her admiration for the younger woman's courage and her sincere hope that the years ahead might bring her genuine happiness and fulfilment. As she returned to St. Clement's by train, observing the landscape pass gradually from urban intensity to rural gentleness, she found herself reflecting on the ways in which our encounters with tragedy might serve to clarify our understanding of what we truly value in life and how we wish to direct our efforts in the years that remain to us. Chapter 8. Silver Linings in Dark Matters. As autumn progressed toward winter, the village of St. Clement's gradually adjusted to the new realities created by the tragedy at the Blue Teapot. The initial shock of discovery gave way to the more measured process of legal proceedings, testimony, and judgment that constituted the formal mechanisms through which society addressed criminal transgression. Rosemary Tucker, while undoubtedly guilty of poisoning Thomas Whitmore, was treated with considerable sympathy by the local magistrate, who recognised that she was as much a victim of William's manipulation as the investigator himself. The magistrate's summing up of the case emphasised that Rosemary, a young woman of limited experience and considerable emotional vulnerability, had been deliberately exploited by someone of superior education and intentional malevolence. She received a sentence of 10 years' imprisonment with a strong recommendation for early release, should her conduct prove exemplary, and should the Home Secretary find reason to exercise clemency. This sentence, while substantial, was considerably less severe than the life imprisonment that William received, and reflected the magistrate's judgment regarding the relative culpability of the two parties involved in Whitmore's death. Miss Marple, while acknowledging the justice of this outcome, found herself troubled by the young woman's fate and by the broader question of how society should address the circumstances of those who had committed crimes while being manipulated by others. She took the liberty of visiting Rosemary at the prison on several occasions, a journey that required her to travel to the nearest county town and navigate the somewhat daunting protocols of the prison system. She offered both emotional support and practical assistance in the form of books and other small comforts that might serve to alleviate the grim circumstances of incarceration. During these visits, Miss Marple observed that Rosemary had achieved a degree of psychological adjustment to her circumstances that suggested growing resilience. The young woman had obtained prison work in the library, a position that allowed her to engage intellectually with texts and to assist other inmates in their efforts at self-improvement. She spoke to Miss Marple of her intentions to pursue further education during her imprisonment and to prepare herself for some form of useful employment upon her eventual release. William Ashford, by contrast, was convicted of murder and received a sentence of life imprisonment. Inspector Slack indicated privately to Miss Marple that William's conduct in prison suggested a man who possessed no genuine capacity for remorse, and regarding his crime merely as an unfortunate circumstance that had disrupted his plans, rather than as a moral abomination requiring contrition. He had attempted to manipulate fellow prisoners and even prison staff through the same combination of charm and subtle intimidation that had served him so effectively in the village, and these efforts had resulted in his isolation and the restriction of certain privileges. Mrs. Felicity, the proprietress of the Blue Teapot, found her business severely disrupted by the notoriety of having been the location of a murder. For several weeks following the tragedy, patronage at the tea shop declined precipitously as villagers approached the establishment with a combination of morbid curiosity and ethical uncertainty regarding whether it was appropriate to consume tea and scones in a location where a death had occurred under such sinister circumstances. Yet gradually, through Miss Marple's tactful efforts to encourage her neighbours to frequent the establishment and to conduct normal life within its walls, the tea shop regained its position as a centre of village social interaction. She observed that there existed in human nature a remarkable capacity to accommodate tragedy and to gradually transform shocking events into components of established historical narrative rather than present reality. The shock of unusual events fades more quickly than we anticipate when the machinery of ordinary life remains steadfast in its routines. Mrs. Felicity herself demonstrated considerable courage in maintaining her establishment and in refusing to allow the tragedy to define the future trajectory of her business. She introduced subtle modifications to the tea shop's appearance, replacing some of the older furnishings and introducing new decorative elements that served to create at least a psychological sense of discontinuity between the present establishment and the location where Whitmore had been murdered. Moreover, she hired a new waitress to replace Rosemary, a young woman named Margaret, who was considerably more experienced and who maintained professional distance from the clientele, rather than engaging in the familiar interactions that had characterized Rosemary's approach to service. The introduction of Margaret created a subtle transformation in the atmosphere of the Blue Teapot, lending it a degree of formality that had perhaps been absent previously, but that seemed appropriate given the establishment's recent history. By December, as the village prepared for Christmas festivities, the Blue Teapot had largely recovered its position as a welcoming gathering place for the village's residents. Miss Marple observed that the tragedy had become historical rather than immediate, relegated to that category of village events that were discussed in hushed tones and referenced in conversation primarily when introducing guests or when recounting the annals of village occurrences over the past year. Chapter 9. The Private Investigator's Legacy. Miss Marple devoted considerable time and effort to understanding the circumstances that had brought Thomas Whitmore to the village, and the broader question of who had engaged him to investigate William Ashford's bigamy. Through her judicious inquiry and through the information gradually revealed during the trial proceedings, she learned that Beatrice Ashford herself had hired him, having finally reached the limits of her emotional endurance regarding her husband's divided affections and his obvious lack of commitment to their marriage. This revelation created a complex and troubling moral landscape. Beatrice had sought only to expose the truth of her husband's deception and to obtain legal grounds for divorce that would permit her to rebuild her life independent of a man who had made clear through his actions that he did not value their matrimonial commitment. Yet her innocent attempt to establish the facts of her situation and to pursue a course of action that seemed both justified and necessary had resulted in the death of an investigator and the imprisonment of both a young woman and a man who, whatever his ultimate intentions, had been motivated by emotional desperation rather than calculated malice. This paradox troubled Miss Marple considerably, and she found herself reflecting at considerable length on the ways in which our attempts to address wrongs often produce consequences neither anticipated nor desired. We like to imagine ourselves as architects of justice, capable of identifying the correct course of action and proceeding with confidence that our choices will produce beneficial outcomes. Yet, in reality, we are often merely participants in a machinery far larger than our individual purposes, and the outcomes of our actions flow in directions beyond our capacity to control or predict. Inspector Slack, in his final meeting with Miss Marple at her cottage, acknowledged that Beatrice bore no legal responsibility for the tragedy that had ensued from her decision to hire Whitmore. The inspector's investigation had made clear that William alone bore responsibility for his decision to commit murder as a response to the threat posed by the investigator's activities. However, he noted that Beatrice had demonstrated remarkable presence of mind and moral clarity in preserving evidence of William's murderous intention, thereby ensuring that the full scope of his crime could be established in court and that he could not later claim that his murder of Whitmore was a momentary lapse or a crime of passion committed in the heat of emotional turmoil. Miss Marple, reflecting on the inspector's comments, found herself contemplating the ways in which individuals might be forced by circumstance to participate in events that shape the lives of others, often in directions never intended or anticipated. She'd seen this pattern throughout her long life in the village, observed in the countless small ways that one person's actions rippled outward to affect others, sometimes with tragic consequences. The murder of Thomas Whitmore was perhaps an extreme example, but it was not fundamentally different from the more subtle ways in which lives intersected and diverged through choices neither entirely free nor entirely constrained. The investigation into Whitmore's death revealed that he had been a man of considerable integrity and dedication to his profession. Those who had known him described him as thorough, meticulous, and driven by a genuine desire to uncover the truth regarding matrimonial deceptions and other matters that concerned his clients. He had begun his career as a police officer, but had transitioned to private investigation because he felt that the formal legal system was sometimes insufficiently responsive to the particular needs of individuals seeking truth in complicated circumstances. Accordingly, Miss Marple arranged for a small memorial service to be held in the village church, honouring Thomas Whitmore and acknowledging the sacrifice that his commitment to truth had ultimately cost. The service was attended by a modest number of villagers, but it served to establish in the collective memory of the community that Whitmore had been something more than merely the unfortunate victim of a crime. He had been a person of purpose and conviction, someone who had died in the pursuit of justice, even though he had not understood that his investigation would ultimately result in his own death. The police force in London, Whitmore's former employer, sent a representative to the service, and this individual delivered remarks acknowledging Whitmore's years of dedicated service and his commitment to the principle that truth should be pursued regardless of the personal cost or the social consequences of revelation. These remarks moved Miss Marple considerably, for they suggested that Whitmore's death, while tragic, might serve to reinforce the commitment of others to the profession of investigation and to the pursuit of truth, even in circumstances where such pursuit might prove dangerous or socially disruptive. Chapter 10. Winter Light and Village Continuities. As December arrived and the village prepared for Christmas, Miss Marple observed that St. Clements had achieved a kind of equilibrium regarding the tragedy that had unfolded in the Blue Teapot. The scandal involving Reverend Ashford's son had settled into the permanent repository of village memory, joining the accumulated histories of previous scandals, triumphs, and ordinary occurrences that constituted the ongoing narrative of provincial life. The new vicar, a man of considerably younger years and more progressive views, had arrived to occupy Reverend Ashford's position. Reverend Ashford himself had retired to a cottage in the neighbouring parish, where he engaged himself in biblical translation and charitable work designed to ameliorate the circumstances of those displaced by industrial change in the cities. Inspector Slack made a final visit to Miss Marple's cottage to discuss the conclusion of his investigation into the death of Thomas Whitmore. All matters have been resolved to the satisfaction of both the local magistrate and Scotland Yard, he reported. The case will be recorded as murder, with conviction secured against William Ashford. Rosemary Tucker will serve her sentence, and it is hoped that time and genuine reformation might afford her the opportunity to rebuild some semblance of a life after her release. Miss Marple received this report with a nod of acknowledgement, though she seemed to be regarding something beyond the immediate circumstances the inspector was describing. "I have been reflecting," she said gently. on the extraordinary complexity that may exist beneath the surface of even the most ordinary village existence. We observe the routines and the proprieties that constitute daily life, and we imagine that we comprehend the essential nature of our neighbours. Yet murder, deception, and profound moral compromise may flourish entirely undetected within the most respectable and apparently content exteriors. The inspector agreed with evident respect. "Your observation has proven invaluable in this matter, Miss Marple. Without your attention to the small inconsistencies of behaviour that others overlooked, the true circumstances might never have been established." As winter deepened and snow began to fall upon the village, Miss Marple returned to her customary life of parish activities and careful observation. She visited the Blue Teapot occasionally, observing that Rosemary's replacement, a more experienced waitress named Margaret, performed her duties with competence, if not with the particular grace that Rosemary had possessed at her best moments. The tea shop's reputation gradually recovered, as the notoriety of the tragedy faded from immediate memory. Yet those who knew the village's history remained aware that something irreversible had occurred within those pleasant walls, that innocence had been lost and the complacency of respectability had been challenged in ways that could never be entirely repaired. Miss Marple, sitting in her customary corner with her teacup and her embroidery, reflected that such was the nature of human life. Violence and deception struck unexpectedly, unravelled the careful structures that people had constructed to contain chaos, and then gradually faded from prominence as the pressing business of daily existence resumed. Yet the experience of crisis left permanent marks upon those who had participated in it, marks that would persist regardless of how carefully they were concealed beneath renewed routines. The conclusion of the matter brought Miss Marple no particular satisfaction, for she had learned long ago that the discovery of truth did not necessarily produce happiness for those touched by tragedy. Rosemary Tucker would serve her sentence, William Ashford would occupy a prison cell, and Beatrice would begin the long process of rebuilding a life following her husband's imprisonment. Thomas Whitmore would remain forever unknown to those he might have aided, his potential contributions to their understanding of themselves forever lost to the poison that had been administered in so pleasant a setting. Yet perhaps, Miss Marple reflected as she watched the snow accumulate on the village rooftops, such was the manner in which human communities functioned. Order emerged from chaos through the patient application of observation and reason. Justice, imperfect though it necessarily was, followed in the wake of truth. And life continued its ordinary progression, enriched and complicated by the accumulation of these extraordinary events that punctuated the surface of apparently peaceful existence.